On today's episode, we talk about how declaring yourself an anti-racist is a much more important credential for the presidency than ending wars that kill black and brown people overseas, how you should never resist arrest because the government always is the correct arbiter of justice and ethics, how there is no moral difference in killing an actively violent person than a bystander, and lastly, how according to one blue checkmark, minorities are so brainwashed and incapable of individual thought that if they choose to marry a white person, it's only due to the white person's racism. This is Cringe Posts. Welcome to this episode. I'm Donald, and our normal other co-host, Britt, is not with us today. Instead, we have a special guest host, who is my brother, David. David, do you have anything you want to plug or shout out?
Thank you so much for having me, Donnie, and I'm sorry that Britt couldn't be here, but maybe another time, all three can be here. But I'll shout out my website if you care anything about what Donnie's brother's doing. You go by Donald on the show, don't you?
Either way is fine,
You do? Okay. I don't remember what Britt calls you on this show.
Probably Donald, but I don't.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know.
So I do a lot of marketing related stuff and a lot of game related stuff. So if you want to learn about what I'm doing, my website davidvkimball.com is a good place to see what I've been working on. I recently worked on a documentary I'm pretty happy with. So if you want to check that out, that's prominently on the front page. So no Googling or searching required. Thanks for letting me plug that.
But what is not prominently on the front page of his website is his cringe post, because we start out every episode by analyzing our own cringe, making fun of ourselves, because if we're going to make fun of other people, we got to be comfortable making fun of ourselves as well. And so because David is with us today, we are taking a look at his cringe post. And David, if you want to read it for us, go ahead.
I'll happily read this. And this was one that I selected, so Donald didn't bully me into picking the most, cringe thing I've ever said. This is something that I voluntarily picked. All right. And the tweet goes as follows. This was posted on February 3rd, 2013. I'm a conservative, not a radical libertarian. The problem with those types are they don't get freedom entails responsibility and tact. Now, what I find hilarious about this is, as someone who really cares about definitions, I'm not sure where responsibility or tact are remotely in the definition of that word, freedom.
You're right. Well, and I was gonna say, I think you don't mean entails so much as requires. Maybe that might be more of the point you're trying to go for, right? Like, you can't have freedom without responsibility and tact. But there's a couple things I want to point out. First, the timestamp, February 3, 2013. What actually is funny to me in my mind is 2013 is the year that I formally started considering myself from a Republican or a conservative to a libertarian. And I know that because 2013 was the year that Rand Paul did his filibuster at his first filibuster. And by that time, Rand Paul was my guy. And so it's funny because I think your tweet here almost is a little too defensive. It's the lady doth protest too much. Because you're almost like, whoa, careful. I'm not one of those radical libertarians. Don't get me associated there. Which is funny, and I'm curious if you have any. This was like nearly a decade ago, but like I don't know if you have any thoughts on why you said radical libertarian, because I have some thoughts on that, and that cracks me up. But is there any thoughts on that word?
It's funny. It demonstrates a tad bit of self-awareness when I talk about tact, because as we know, I think it's fair to say that libertarians aren't always the most tactful. I think That's actually pretty fair. But what's funny is I just don't have the right point here at all. I think I was really focusing on that, but freedom does not entail responsibility or tact. Freedom is the freedom to be as irresponsible and tactless as you want. That's inherent in freedom. Yeah. So I don't really know what I was trying to say here so much. I think I was just making a comment about how I don't want to associate with those crazy tactless libertarians.
Right.
And I don't know why I would even say, why would I bring freedom into it at all?
Well, and that's what's funny to me is I think the radical point is that anytime you want to distance yourself from a position, you use some kind of descriptor that makes it sound way out there, Yeah. And so it's like, you can't just be a libertarian, you have to be a radical libertarian. But what's funny about that too is it's like, if you apply that word in any other context, it's like, I'm not, I'm not one of those radical, don't want to kill all babies kinds of people. You know what I mean? Like no, I'd very much like to be a radical, don't kill babies person. I'm radical in that sense.
Yeah.
So that's one thing that makes me laugh, because the word, and I think radical libertarian, I think, is one of those phrases that was in the mainstream media oftentimes to sort of dismiss. It's one of those automatic, this person's a fanatic, you can disregard this ideology. And so that was why it was on your lips there, as it would be on mine, because it's just the vernacular that the media wanted to paint. Just sort of like, wacky Ron Paul or goofy Ron Paul, like way crazy out there, radical libertarian.
Yeah, it was definitely around that time, the peacekeeper moderate, like the more balanced you were perceived to be, the better. It's kind of like how it was perceived. So I think, and even now that's carried over to where you just say radical anything and it just has this negative connotation because you're a radical.
Yeah. Well, and then last thing I will say, of course, so the problem is with those types is they don't get freedom, entails, responsibility, and tact. So instead, we should make sure to entrust all the power into one group of people who are going to make sure that you have no freedom, and they shirk their responsibility all the time. So anyway, enough beating David over the head with his old tweet. We're going to move on to our quick cringe segment. So we're starting with this one, and it's a blue checkmark response, so we out him. The original tweet was questioning this person named Richie Castaldo, who is, for those who don't know, is in he's in the libertarian circles, and he's what insider libertarian politics might call a fakertarian, or the loser brigade, for those who are familiar with Tom Woods lingo. And he's one of those who feels very much that they're trying to appeal to the the popular crowd, to be in with and respectable in proper society. And so the original tweet asks Richie Castaldo, out of these two candidates for office, which would you vote for? A, an anti-racist who promises to continue the wars in the Middle East, or B, someone who would end every war on his first day, but didn't want his daughter to date a minority. And the cringe post is Richie replying A. He would rather an anti-racist who promises to continue the wars in the Middle East, rather than someone who would end every war on his first day but didn't want his daughter to date a minority. Now, if nothing else, this demonstrates to me the complete lack of priorities, because by nature of the poll here, there are two bad options. And no one would say that, I'm not saying that someone who doesn't want his daughter to date a minority is a great thing. Like, as vague as that might be, let's just assume the worst motive to it's because he's an outright racist. Well, yeah, that's a really big character flaw, and I think that it would impair his judgment in many ways. But an anti-racist who promises to continue the wars in the Middle East, all they are is an anti-racist in name only. All they are is an anti-racist who cares about looking anti-racist, not doing things that are anti-racist, because as long as we can keep bombing brown people in the Middle East where no one cares, but I get perceived as an anti-racist, it's okay. I don't know if you have any initial thoughts on this.
It is an odd one, because an anti-racist is a statement. Does that mean that he promulgates himself as an anti-racist?
Right.
Is there any action that he's done to prove it? And this immediately makes me think of another parallel, which is, racism is the big topic right now, and it's like there are lifestyle choices that you can consider objectionable, and one of those could be not wanting your daughter to date a minority. That's pretty despicable. I would also argue having an affair is pretty despicable too. So you could almost substitute that. I wonder if his answer would have changed if it was a pro-marriage guy who promises to end the wars versus someone who would have an affair with his wife. Right. If that would change his response or not. Because it seems like, if the priorities were aligned, he would still pick A, which is just as silly, in my opinion.
Right, but you and I know that that's not the case, because, having an affair, well, it's not the most respected thing in society. It's not what the cultural elites care about. What they care about right now is racism. And so as long as you look anti-racist, and I think you brought up a good point when you're saying, is there any sort of actions that this person has taken to make them an anti-racist? Because the declaration is they are an anti-racist. But, of course, I think in the modern context, people who call themselves anti-racist are usually just the ones who are screaming it the loudest, not necessarily doing anything. I think there were plenty of anti-racists who marched with Black Lives Matter and smashed the small businesses of black owned, that were owned by black people in the streets. So, or even you could even argue that the anti-racists who promote critical race theory, which in and of itself is this terribly racist ideology, system of thought that leads to a racist ideology. So, and again, this isn't coming from someone who at least identifies on the left. This is coming from someone who allegedly is a libertarian. And if you're a libertarian and your number one priority is not stopping the absolute bloodshed that the government is enacting, I mean, I don't see how you can claim the mantle of libertarianism very well, because everything the government does to oppress us that we feel at home ultimately is secondary to murdering people overseas who are innocent. When you drone a village and you've wiped out that village of innocent people just because they're not near to us, geographically, that doesn't make it less important, because that's everything. Life is everything. And everything the state does is, an aberration on life. Taking it is the final step in that.
Yeah, it's funny because it compares serious actions regarding life, like you just said, with a personal life preference about race, which could be completely wrong. But we're talking about an action versus a worldview, maybe? I don't know if that's a good comparison or not. But.
No, you're exactly right, because it's not like the second prompt here is saying this guy would end every war on his first day, but he would also bring back Jim Crow. That's not the prompt. The prompt is he doesn't want his daughter to date a minority.
Yeah.
And so like you're saying, it's like more of a, are you a good person versus would you do a good action?
I say you exploit this. You put in your Twitter bio, Donald, that you're an anti-racist, and just see how far that gets you.
Right.
I say give that a shot.
Well, maybe the next time, there are some protests, I can run into the store and grab a $300 Lego set in the name of Black Lives Matter to prove I'm an anti-racist. So, all right, moving on to the next quick cringe. Oh, this one's another blue check mark. I think this one might be all blue check marks today, because it's really good. It's Charlie Kirk says, "Don't resist arrest." That's it.
Help me out with that one, because I can't immediately discover or figure out why that's a cringe take.
Well, it's a cringe take in a lot of ways. First of all, I think that you're to say that the government has a right just to lock you down no matter what, don't resist arrest. Well, if you're being wrongfully set up, if you're in a situation where the cops are on you and you've done nothing wrong, you should absolutely resist arrest. Secondarily, he's probably going to be one of the first proponents to resisting arrest if the government takes over your guns. So he absolutely would recommend resisting arrest too. And that's the funny thing, is the don't resist arrest line only comes out when it's people doing things that you find objectionable. And so as soon as the laws change and are flipped on you, this line makes no sense. I think you and I can easily see you can't conflate morality and legality. You can't say that those two are correlated by any metric, or else, anyone who is under Jim Crow should not have protested or don't resist arrest. And what else is funny about this too is that it assumes that the people who are in the situations where they're resisting arrest are always at fault, when there are clear examples of cops coming in on someone who's hands down on the ground, face in the dirt, not moving, and they still shoot them. And it's like, I don't think that the systemic racism that is peddled by many on the left is real in the way that they say it is. But it is very true that the state has put a lot of black people, and a lot of people in general, it doesn't even have to be a race thing, but it has put a lot of black people in these situations where they feel uncomfortable, and sometimes they have a choice of, I can run away from this situation and try to escape with my life, or I can bow down and still potentially get shot. I'm not willing to just default to the state in this scenario. I don't know if you have any thoughts on this one in particular, but it's just when you see all these constant examples of of state police acting in a manner that is not just, it seems really cringe to me to just blanket statement, don't resist arrest. Like they're these infallible creatures, like
right.
you shouldn't use your judgment, just surrender to the state.
Well, not only that, it's not only supposing that the people in those positions can do no wrong, but the laws under which they're acting are impervious too. And And that seems like it's like a twofer right there. So I'm also wondering, what's the context around why he said that? Do you know the context?
I do, and it actually ties into our next one, I believe, if the timing on this is correct. So I'll move into this next cringe post, which again we have a blue check mark. Although this person's Twitter, name versus their actual name is so long that I actually don't remember who this is off the top of my head. But it is a blue check mark if you want to go find it on Twitter. The quote is, "People who are arguing that because one teen might have gotten stabbed otherwise, it was better that police shot and killed another teen. How does that make any sense outside of racism and the adultification and dehumanization of black girls?" So both of these tweets that don't resist arrest, as well as this one questioning, are revolving around the situation just about a month and a half ago now, maybe 2 months, where there were two under 18 girls. I believe they were like in 16 or 17 years of age, and one had a knife and was about to stab the other because they were in an altercation, and the cop was running out of his car, and there's body cam footage of it, and shoots the aggressor with the knife, and she's fatally wounded and dies. And so I actually don't know that the Charlie Kirk one was about this, now that I think about it, but I think it was, again, one of those situations where the cops had shot someone. Now, the funny thing is, right after coming on the tails of criticizing Charlie Kirk for, and the state and the police for, it's like, this is the fight they want to take. She cannot process the idea that shooting someone who's about to kill someone else is a better outcome than just letting the other person kill the victim there. I don't understand how your mind does not differentiate in the same way. Now, I don't believe in the death penalty, but I've also always thought that the comparisons between the death penalty and, say, abortion, when people try to say conservatives are so inconsistent on this issue, the state can kill someone in one case but not in the other, and it's like, well, no, because the difference is with the death penalty, allegedly this person's been a criminal, they've forfeited their right, and so that's why they deserve death, whereas a baby in the case of abortion has not done that. I don't think that's a super fair. I'm not pro-death penalty. But in the same way, this person is saying, oh, you're just killing one person for another. There's no moral difference between the person who was gonna be stabbed versus the person who was doing the stabbing. And to me, that's just such a funny thing to not understand.
Yeah, I mean, you answered her question. How does that make any sense? There you go. That's how it makes sense.
Right.
This pulling in race and adultification and dehumanizing of black girls, it's really a stretch. I mean, use the same situation and don't specify their race or what gender they are, and try to figure out and just look at the facts and say, like, what is the better outcome? Is the better outcome that they just do nothing and let one person stab the other person? Is that the outcome you wanted? Had that happened, would you have had no problem with what happened? And just have them answer that question.
Right. Well, and you bring up that sort of brings up two other points, which is, I think, had the cop done that, had the cop arrived and not shot, you would have seen the racist cries again. Oh, look, he didn't intervene to save her life because he thinks she's worthless as a black person. And I was talking with Britt about this, and Britt and I had to look up adultification, but that is also within this sort of intersectional idea where black, usually minorities, and sometimes women, usually black males, though, are tried as adults or perceived as adults when they are below 18, whereas white people are, when they're like 17, are just called boy or something, whereas a 17-year-old black person would be called a man and whatnot. But I think that anyone in the situation who watches the body cam footage can see that there's no time for the dude to process their adultification or race or anything. He rushes to the scene and he acts that fast. You do not have the time to process these things. And it's certainly not a dehumanization, because if it was a dehumanization, he wouldn't have cared what the outcome was and wouldn't have stepped in to intervene. Now, I don't think I have them, but I think I got rid of them by accident, but I had for a little bit some of the best takes under this, because a lot of the people who are criticizing the cops' actions, I don't have them, unfortunately, so I'll have to paraphrase and get your reaction, David. But a lot of the people who are criticizing this were proposing some very reasonable and not at all insane, absurd alternatives that the cop could have done. So let me tell you, what do you think he could have done in this situation? I just want to see your raw reaction. couldn't the cop have shot a warning shot in the air, fired a warning shot into the air?
Yeah, he, you know what? He could have, and if I know anything about a criminal, I know through a warning shot, they would have just stopped what they are doing because they heard a warning shot.
Right. Well, and not to mention a bullet goes up, it's got to come down, so that's wildly dangerous to begin with. And second, I don't know, I feel like if your action is like doing this with a knife, and you hear a gunshot, I don't think your initial reaction is to go, I think it's probably to go, yeah, just to finish, if you know, that's just a terrible idea. Second suggestion that I've seen, couldn't he have just used a taser? And that's such a silly idea. I don't know if you're that familiar with tasers, but they don't work through clothes very well. They have a much shorter range, and when you come upon a situation, you need to be prepared for whatever the situation is, you know, to defend yourself. So that's not going to be your first instinct as a taser. So no, that's not a reason. It's so much harder to hit a taser than it is a bullet too. So terrible suggestion. And then I'm trying to remember, there was one more. Oh yes, and the most absurd one. And you and I have shot guns. You know how absurd this is. They said, couldn't you have just shot her in the leg or something? And it's like, no. You've never aimed a gun. You don't know how hard it is to be accurate. You don't know how hard it is to be accurate quickly. And you don't know how hard it is to be accurate quickly and non-lethally. That is an absurd combination that these people have these unrealistic expectations.
Yeah, it's like when I play Call of Duty, sometimes I don't get headshots on purpose. It's like, it's probably the same thing.
Yeah. Well, I know that that's not true because when's the last time you've played Call of Duty? Let's be real.
Yeah, true.
Okay, and so moving on to our long form cringe. This one is honestly so good. I'm very excited for this one. So This was right after an awards show, and Bill Burr hosted it. And Bill Burr made a lot of jokes that people were considering edgy and racist because he's an offensive comedian. I find him pretty funny. I think he's a really funny guy. But his jokes are offensive, and so not everything he says I like either, just because sometimes they offend me. But people were considering his jokes racist, and so this person tweets out a picture of Bill Burr and his wife, who is black, and she tweets out Gen Z calling Bill Burr a racist, Bill Burr and his beautiful wife, Naya. And, oh man, this blue checkmark, Claiborne Griffin, replies to this and says, "While I'm not suggesting Bill Burr is a racist, a white man having a non-white wife can sometimes be a sign of racism. So you shouldn't assume someone isn't racist just because they own a minority sex servant. They may very well have one because they're racist." Now, understandably, this got absolutely ratioed and lambasted. And so he was responding in another thread to someone asking about this. And he says, "Nah, it's taken out of context and being spread by the alt-right in order to obfuscate." I think I'm saying that word correctly. It's a hard word. Obfuscate, yeah. Thank you. "The original point and paint a narrative that critical race theory is racist." What are your first thoughts on this, David?
My first thoughts are, I remember when that happened.
Yep.
I saw that. I remember seeing that and being dumbfounded. Because your first thought is, okay, so a white man being married to a black woman can be a sign of racism. It can be. So does it... So, like, you're stuck, right?
Right.
Where do you go from there? So how do you... If you make an edgy joke, and let's say some people consider it racist, and you are trying to lay out the evidence for you, I possess a worldview where I'm not a racist person. What hope do you have of convincing someone that says something like that?
Well,
and also he jumps to just because they own a minority sex servant. Where did that come from? That came out of nowhere. That's disturbing.
It's the most
he would think
racist thing that's been said there. Not Bill Burr's jokes are jokes. And in order for a joke that is offensive to be funny, you have to recognize that the thing being said is offensive and wrong. That's what makes an offensive joke funny. Not, oh man, he's so correct, ha ha ha. That's not what makes an offensive joke funny. The offensive joke is, oh my gosh, what you said is so, like, wrong and out of place and twisted.
And morally wrong.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so this person saying that owning is so much more racist because it's taking away the agency of any minority who wanted to make their own choice and to say, no, I love Bill Burr for who he is. He knows who I am, and we've made this commitment to each other. No, you've taken away that agency and said, nope, you are his minority sex servant. You didn't have a choice. You are too stupid to realize that he's using you. What an absolute horrible, horrible thing to say. And how you point out that being white can be a sign of racism. What's funny about that is the way he words it is almost a step more extreme than the just because you're married to a black person doesn't mean you're not racist. He takes it a step further, saying being married can be explicitly a sign of racism.
Yeah.
And it's very illuminating, his second tweet, how he says it's being taken out of context. Nope, this is the full context right here. That's the context. And paint a narrative that critical race theory is racist. And it's funny because when I think about it in terms of critical race theory, it comes together for me. It clicks why he would think and say these things. You and I recently were listening to Dr. James Lindsay talk about critical race theory, and one of the things that he brings up is how it's not a matter of if the situation is racist, it's how it's racist. Because racism just exists. It is the natural state of things. And so, he's married to a black person? Well, that has to be racism, because he's white. So there is innate racism there. And so when you think about it through the lens of critical race theory, where everything is intersectionalized, everything is put in boxes of who you are as your sexual identity, who you are as your skin color. Those are the only things that matter about you, and you have to perceive everything through that with the assumption that the white person is being racist. Then his tweet makes sense. But that is such a perverted worldview that takes away individual autonomy and dehumanizes people beyond. It dehumanizes the individual, and reduces them to their race, reduces them to their skin, reduces them to their sex, reduces them to an ideology of racism or being used by racists.
Yeah, that is absurd. It's so the more you're explaining it, but then when you think about critical race theory, and it's this idea of there's a direct correlation between how white you are and how racist you could possibly be, and Dr. Lindsay pointed out where it's like it's not like minority versus white people. It's the way that he phrased it was like you can have brown people be racist against black people, because it's not contextual, it's not like cultural. It is simply black is the bottom of the totem pole and white is the top, and there's no nuance, or there's no other context. It's bizarre. I don't know where they get that.
It's funny because when you put it in that context, it almost makes you think of how the racists painted an Uncle Tom, like that whole concept of, oh, the black person who apologizes for the racism of the white person. And it undermines the agency and individualism of the black person to say that they have their own thoughts and they can break away from what common narrative they're being told to think. If they're, if they dare defend the white man in any way, or say, no, I think you're being unfair here, you're just a tool to be used. So his claim here is calling her an Uncle Tom of sorts. And it's just a simple racist assumption to make about her that she has to be covering for the white person, rather than, no, she's made her individual choice. She has her own autonomy. And maybe, and this is another funny thing, is that if you as a white person ever try to talk to a black person about what they've experienced, or maybe disagree with how their lived experience translates to public policy, like, well, that's really sucks, but I think that's less a systemic racism thing and more discrimination of the state, kind of whatever. They will always come back at you with the lived experience. You can't have that experience. You don't know my perspective as a black person. And to some degree that, like, okay, yeah, there is truth in the sense that I'm not a black person. I will never see things firsthand. That doesn't mean I can't diagnose or that you can't misdiagnose. But it's funny because that's usually something that's used to argue for them. But he takes that away from her, right? Because her lived experience cannot trump his view that she's a minority sex servant and that Bill Burr having a non-white wife is the sign of racism. But she's happy. She's not the one making these calls saying my husband's racist. But her lived experience does not trump his, so he has to white-splain and mansplain her experience to her.
What's more consistent? The let's say there's two people and they both fully are invested in critical race theory. And one person says this comment, and the other person says something to the effect of, as a white person, I can't speak to, his wife's experience marrying him, I guess, because I'm not in her shoes. But beware, white man is around. Like, is that more consistent? Even though it's a lot dumber of a thing to say, well, is that more consistent?
I think so. I think because, again, I think it was that nuanced, having a non-white wife can sometimes be a sign of racism, rather than being married to someone who's having a non-white wife doesn't mean you're not a racist. I think that's a nuance that's actually important and kind of distinguishes those two views, because in the second example of someone saying, I haven't lived her experience, but be careful, because a white man can do a bad thing, at that point, she's at least saying that a white person can have, can still be a racist, even if he's doing this thing. It could be like virtue signal. It could be a sign. I don't know the truth. But this person just says, again, rather than having any benefit of the doubt and just using caution, like use the lens of caution when viewing things, it's a lens of, no, this is racist. I know this is racist. Because life is racist, white people are racist. That's the assumption. Mm-hmm. And so when you look at that as, again, the original sin of living, meaning you are racist, then everything has to be a sign of racism. And so the very thing that you would think would excuse you from racism is what makes you racist. That makes me think of a little bit of what he touched on with the religious element of critical race theory, where you need to prove your holiness, and you almost need to continually apologize, and flagellate yourself. That's what I'm thinking about. And so in the same way, it's almost like this is the step up, because I think we've heard things where people say it's racist to not be equally attracted to everyone of the same race, or you're a bigot if you don't find trans people a trans woman attractive. As you hear these things, and I think that's utterly contemptible, because biologically speaking, you have no control on what you're attracted to, really. Not to mention, it's a contemptible ideology in general to say that you owe anyone else your attraction. Like, what a weird, creepy mindset.
Yeah.
But
anybody that's staunchly for marriage equality should acknowledge that you can't help your proclivities. They are what they are.
Right. Well, and that's always been the dance there, right? It's where it's helpful to say it's a choice, and where it's helpful to say I was born this way, they'll say that. And that's why you have the gender and sex spectrum, handy switch off there, why they had to separate those out, I think. But even when you had that sort of disingenuous, in my opinion, idea being promulgated, at the very least, it was to say, okay, well, I married a black person, I married an Asian person, I married a Mexican person, I married whatever, I'm not racist. But now this goes the step further and says, not so fast. Not only do you have to be attracted to everyone, but now that's not a sign of not being a racist, and in fact can be a sign of being racist. And it's honestly so wild how, and it feels like a parody. It feels like the conservative boomer cartoons of yesteryear that were making fun of sort of doing the slippery slope argumentation and taking it to its logical extreme, and here we are.
Yeah.
So yeah. Just really not a lot of depth in his line of thought, other than I mean, just the I think his unapologetic stature in the second tweet is also worth noting, right? He doesn't take a time to reflect that what he said might be wrong. He doesn't take time to reflect that he's being racist, which, again, it seems so apparent and obvious just by reading his Twitter. He doubles down and says that it's being taken out of context, when really it's not.
I'm curious if there's, like, from the many, I'm sure, critiques that he got in that initial response, if he ever did any doubling down or following up in that thread, or, because I can't imagine trying to defend yourself after that, unless it's a separate thread, I guess, where you say it was just taken out of context and you can just throw all your criticisms that way.
I don't think so. I mean, maybe there is, but I mean, I think it was probably quote tweeted so much that he would have had a million different paths to choose from for who to respond. But it's actually really funny too, just to look at the tweet. He does the thing that we talked about in the beginning that you did with the radical libertarian by saying being spread by the alt-right. He can't even just say being spread by, right-wingers or being spread to paint to abuse. Right. He has to say by the alt-right, which of course he has no idea what the alt-right is. Anyone in the mainstream has no idea what the actual alt-right is. Let's be honest. Like if you asked someone to find the alt-right, they'd be like Ben Shapiro, and you're like, oh my gosh, cringe. Like that's not the alt-right,
Yeah, it's funny because I think for some reason when I think about the right being bad, I think about the Simpsons episode that I will never forget where it's Mr. Burns and it just says the Republican Party and it's like this haunted mansion with like lightning in the background and stuff. And that's funny. It's just funny because it's how mainstream media portrays the right or whatever. But now I feel like that's not good enough for people. They need to say alt-right to really sell it.
Yep.
I think in certain circles, if you say Republican or right-wing, that's just as good as saying alt-right. But I think to really sell it, you say alt-right, and that really puts that edge to it.
Well, yeah, I think you're right, because I think when you say Republican, it's like, oh, that just discredits you. But if you say alt-right, it becomes nefarious. It becomes
you're radical. You're a radical.
Exactly. It's this buzzword to scare people, and of course he's making this claim that it's the alt-right that's trying to paint the narrative that critical race theory is racist, and I'm like, nope. It's a lot of just very normal parents that can like read, that's your alt-right, that's protesting this. One of the most interesting things about this mischaracterization of who's attacking critical race theory is Chris Rufo is one of the biggest opponents of critical race theory and has done a lot of exposing. And it's funny because people will paint him as like, oh, this far right Chris Rufo. I know Chris Rufo, not like super well, but I've met the guy personally. He used to be on the board for the place that I worked, or on one of the boards, not the main board. He's not a conservative guy by what their definition would be. He might be to the Seattle crowd or the woke crowd, but like he's a very, very moderate in terms of like conservative, liberal, maybe personal preferences. And as far as I'm aware, I don't know that he's ever advocated anything other than just not promoting racism and then trying to solve homelessness. So much to the point where his wife and kids, who are Asian, by the way, were called racist names in the school and had death threats sent to them. So he had to drop out of running for Seattle City Council, his race, just because he said, hey, homelessness is a problem. Not saying we need to kick him out. So all that being said, so one of your biggest people who's, trying to spread
your biggest advocate.
Well, yeah. Well, the opposition to critical race theory. If you're calling him alt-right, he's maybe the most right, public speakers on this. He's not alt-right by any means. He's barely like right. He's, maybe more free market, but like, it's such a bad characterization. And as far as I'm aware, I could be mistaken on this, but I think Dr. James Lindsay also did not come from a place of conservatism. I'm pretty sure he came from the left and saw the absurdity and sort of had to come around to it.
Yeah, and he mentioned about his critics, he says, you have a degree in mathematics. What credentials do you have to talk about this? And he just said, I can read.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like, and that brings up a good point. It's like, let's say your only academic credential is some really obscure underwater basket weaving. Does that somehow discredit you from pointing out something in a completely other realm? It seems like really weird that people would jump on him for his mathematics degree. Like, is it better to have no degree than to have a mathematics degree in that situation? Well, it's really weird.
I would love to talk to someone about that, because the easiest thing in the world to point out is say, okay, fine. He loses all credibility on anything except for mathematics. So let's enact all of critical race theory, but we have to talk about mathematics because he actually has a degree in mathematics. You can't start teaching that math is racist because of the outcomes of white math or whatever. And they'll say, no. the mathematics degree he has is entrenched in that white supremacy. And then you can easily point back and say, okay, so you're saying that his degree is biased from the source it came from. So then why is your degree in gender studies, minority studies, whatever degree you're saying is relevant to critical race theory, how is that not similarly too biased and a byproduct of the very thing you're trying to promote in the same way? Because
it's the one exception, obviously, because it's looking at
exactly
it.
Right, and that's the exact problem, is that they're not willing to cede any ground in the name of being fair, because if you did that, if you ceded ground to make things logical and consistent, they'd realize that critical race theory has no place, because you end up with outcomes like Claiborne Griffith's tweet here.
But they're doing the highest good in their mind.
Yeah.
So
well, and that's all that really counts. And so I sure hope that our Richie Castaldo from I hope he has a successful campaign managing of Claiborne Griffin's presidential campaign, since this man is obviously such an anti-racist that he's willing to call out Bill Burr for being a racist, for being married to a black woman, and not focus at all at ending the wars in the Middle East. So with that being said, we're going to wrap up this episode. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you, David, for being a guest host once again. This is David. He's my brother. And last shout out again for the end here, if you want to plug yourself.
Definitely. If you are interested in content that I'm making, you can visit my website, davidvkimball.com. And hopefully, if any of you happen to stop by and comment on any of my social media posts, please say that you heard it from this podcast. I'd be very interested if anyone happens to do that. All
right. And speaking of social media and the Webernets, make sure to stop by our Twitter, our website, any social media. If you found something that we said that made you cringe, make sure to call us out on that there. And we will catch you for the next one. See you later.